Take that necklace off, Miss Bondi. This is a courtroom, not a church. The words echoed like a gavel striking bone. Pam Bondi, tall, composed, dressed in a muted navy pantsuit, touched the small gold cross around her neck with her thumb. Her eyes didn't waver. Your Honor, she said softly but firmly. This is not just a necklace. It's a symbol of my faith. Judge Harold Kingston, a man with a face as rigid as the oak bench he sat upon, leaned forward, fingers steepled under his chin. And I made it clear personal religious symbols are not permitted in my courtroom, not for litigants, and certainly not for legal counsel. Remove it or be fined for contempt. The courtroom tensed. A murmur rippled through the gallery like wind through dry leaves. This was a high-profile case, the People versus Calden Pharmaceuticals. $1 billion lawsuit. And Bondi had been the unexpected star of the defense team, called in just 3 days prior after the lead attorney fell ill. Contempt, Pam repeated, her voice calm but sharp as glass. For exercising my First Amendment rights. Kingston's jaw tightened. Do not lecture me on the Constitution, Miss Bondi. This court will not be turned into a political stage. A beat of silence. The court reporter looked up briefly, fingers frozen above her keys. Bondi reached up, unhooked the necklace, and laid it gently on the defense table. Her expression didn't flinch. Fine me, she said, her eyes locking with the judge's. But I'll pay it, in pennies each stamped with "In God We Trust." A gasp erupted from the gallery. Kingston slammed the gavel down. $1,000. Now sit down before I make it two. She sat, quiet, still, but in her stillness was something electric. The opposing counsel, Martin Graves, a Harvard graduate, with a face meant for political billboards, smirked, as if the spectacle had confirmed every bias he held about small-town prosecutors playing big-league games. He'd underestimated her, so had Kingston. Everyone had. The trial resumed. Expert testimony. Pharmaceutical jargon. Documents flashed across screens. Graves was thorough, charismatic, polished. But every time Bondi stood to cross-examine, something shifted. You said the trials were double-blind. Correct. She asked one expert. Yes. And yet your internal emails, she held one up, projected large on the courtroom monitor. Discuss outcomes before the trials were concluded. Care to explain how that's possible in a truly blind setup? Graves objected. Overruled. The witness stammered. Your Honor, I move to strike on what grounds? Bondi snapped, stepping forward, her voice like thunder rumbling over Florida sand. That I asked a question your witness wasn't ready for. The judge stared, but said nothing. On the third day, she came in without makeup, her hair tied in a bun, the necklace still gone. The cross, however, now sat on the table beside her legal pad like a silent co-counsel. During recess, she sat, alone on a bench, outside the courthouse. A reporter approached, camera slung across his chest. Pam, mind if I ask why keep it off now? Making a point, she looked up, eyes clouded but focused. I didn't take it off because I wanted to. I did it to keep the focus on the case. But don't mistake my silence for surrender. That quote ran on every local channel that night. By morning, it was national. The courtroom filled to capacity. People started lining up outside before dawn, some holding small paper crosses. Kingston ordered all religious symbols removed from the audience. That only made it worse. On the fifth day, during redirect, Graves made a critical misstep. He presented a chart showing adverse effects from Calden's blood thinner, labeled in red. Bondi stood. Permission to approach the monitor. Granted. Kingston sighed. She walked to the screen, tapped the chart. Mr. Graves, you highlighted these as side effects. But these are not side effects. They're fatalities. Graves blinked. They were isolated incidents. She turned to the jury. 6 people died. That's not an incident. That's a funeral. Graves tried to object. The judge allowed it, but the damage was done, jurors murmured. A woman in the third row visibly wiped a tear. Then came Friday, closing arguments. Graves delivered his with practiced flair. Then it was Bondi's turn. She stood, walked to the center of the courtroom. The cross sat in her palm. Before I speak about Calden Pharmaceuticals, let me say this. I came here as a lawyer. I didn't expect to be fined for what I wear around my neck. But if you must know, this isn't jewelry. It's a reminder. She held it up, not to the judge, but to the jury. A reminder that every life matters, that justice is not blind to suffering. Judge Kingston shifted in his seat. Your Honor, she said, turning to him now, I respect your authority. I've complied with your rules. But this, she raised the cross slightly, is not a prop. It's who I am. And if that offends the law, then perhaps the law needs reminding of its roots. He didn't respond. She continued. They buried 6 people because a company chose profit over safety. They silenced whistleblowers, paid off doctors, buried data, and they thought no one would look close enough. She stepped closer to the jury box, but I did, and I will keep looking, cross or no cross. When she sat down, the courtroom was silent. Some jurors had tears in their eyes. Even the court clerk looked shaken. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Damages, $450 million. Outside, the press mobbed her. Flashes, shouts. Then Judge Kingston called an unexpected press conference. Reporters whispered. Was it to defend his actions? To scold the circus? He stepped up to the mic, adjusted his glasses. I fined Attorney Bondi because I believed I was upholding neutrality. But I failed to recognize the deeper principle. Justice doesn't require the absence of belief. It requires the presence of truth. Miss Bondi reminded us of that, and for that, I rescind the fine, publicly, with apology. Reporters gasped. Bondi stood beside him, stunned. He turned to her. You were right. It wasn't jewelry. It was a sword. She extended a hand. He shook it. And just like that, the woman fined for wearing a cross became the legal giant no one saw coming. Pam didn't smile when the cameras surged forward, didn't wave, didn't perform. She simply nodded, pressed her lips together, and walked straight down the courthouse steps with her worn leather briefcase in one hand and the tiny gold cross clutched tightly in the other. Her heels clicked down each stone like a metronome, ticking towards something inevitable. No one noticed that her eyes glistened not with triumph, but with something deeper, relief, or perhaps something older, like vindication that wasn't supposed to come. Behind her, Judge Kingston lingered at the podium, the media now fixated on the symbolic turnaround, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered her opening argument, the quiet fury behind her voice. He remembered the jury's expression when she revealed Calden's falsified medical reports. He remembered thinking, she doesn't just argue, she exposes. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very person he tried to silence had just reignited a national conversation on freedom, law, and faith in public life. But Pam didn't care about any of that. Not really. As she reached her black Dodge parked beside the curb, her phone buzzed. Pam, you watching the news right now? It was her mother calling from Tampa. I lived it, Mom, she said quietly, unlocking the door. Sweetheart, they're calling you the Crossfire attorney. There's a full segment on CNN about you. Pam chuckled softly and leaned her head back against the driver's seat. I didn't ask for that title. No, but you earned it. There was a pause. You okay? Her mother asked, voice gentle now. I'm tired. But yeah, I think I'm okay. As she drove through the streets of Tallahassee, billboards blurred into lines, buildings melted into haze. The adrenaline was fading, and with it came the crashing realization that she had just taken down one of the largest pharmaceutical giants in America and pissed off half the legal elite doing it. She could already imagine the calls to the Bar Association, the editorials, the carefully worded law review critiques disguised as scholarly concern. But none of that mattered, because 6 people who had no voice were now heard, because truth, wrapped in a cross and clad in a navy blue pantsuit, had stood its ground. By the time she reached her small apartment 2 blocks from the University District, night had fallen. The sky hung like deep ink over the city, and a single street lamp flickered outside her window. She dropped her briefcase by the door and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cross in her palm. A knock startled her. She opened the door to find Alan Russo, her paralegal and longtime friend, holding a bottle of bourbon and 2 plastic cups. I figured you might need this, he said. She stepped aside. Did you get fired yet? She asked as he poured them drinks. He raised a cup. Not yet, but I'm pretty sure Calden's legal team has already sent a courier pigeon with a poisoned letter. Pam snorted, then silence. Alan glanced at her. You were magnificent today. I was angry. Same thing. Pam looked at her drink. You know what I keep thinking about? The look on Kingston's face. When I held the cross up, he looked like someone had unplugged him from the Matrix. Pam laughed. A real guttural laugh. God, that's terrible, but accurate. They sat in silence. Again. Then Alan leaned forward. So, what now? She exhaled slowly. Now I wait. For the fallout. For the Board of Ethics. For the anonymous letters. For the death threats from pharmabots. Worth it. She didn't answer. Just picked up the cross, looped the chain back around her neck, and clasped it. I didn't wear it for anyone but me, she whispered, and maybe that's what they couldn't stand. 3 days later, her email was a battleground, invitations to speak, threats of lawsuits, praise from law students, hate mail from anonymous accounts. A senator's office asked her to testify before a committee on corporate negligence. A conservative talk show begged her to appear. A progressive legal journal called her dangerously persuasive. Then came the letter, handwritten, no return address, Miss Bondi. My wife was one of the 6 you spoke for. No one else ever called her by name in court. No one but you. Thank you. She kept that letter. On the following Monday, Kingston called her into his chambers. She entered cautiously. Unsure if this was reconciliation or reprimand, he gestured for her to sit. His desk was immaculate. Behind him, the state seal glinted under artificial light. I wanted to speak privately, he began, because the court of public opinion is loud these days, and I fear I contributed to some of that noise. Pam tilted her head. You followed your rules, Your Honor. You thought you were being fair. He nodded. And I was wrong about the symbol, but more importantly about the woman wearing it. Pam said nothing. Kingston hesitated, then slid a folder across the desk. What's this? A recommendation for the State Ethics Board, affirming your conduct as exemplary, not contemptuous. I believe the record should reflect the truth. Pam opened the folder, typed, signed, stamped. She looked up. Thank you. I should be thanking you, Kingston said. You reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. They sat in silence for a long beat. Then Pam stood. Permission to speak freely, Your Honor. Always. You were a hard ass. He burst out laughing. Fair. And I don't forget slights. But I also don't forget grace. She extended a hand. He shook it. That week, law schools began adding her final argument to their syllabus under the unit Moral Persuasion in the courtroom. She received a call from the governor's office, inquiring whether she'd consider a position as a special prosecutor. Pam declined. I'm not done in court, she told them, and the courtroom isn't done with me. But the biggest surprise came on a Thursday morning when she opened her inbox and saw the subject line, from Ruth H., Supreme Court Chamber. She clicked, hands shaking. Pam, I watched your closing argument twice. We need more of that in our courts, more courage, more clarity. If ever you consider clerking again or something more permanent, call me. RBG. Pam sat back, eyes wide. A tear rolled down her cheek before she even realized it had begun. She whispered aloud, well, damn. A month passed. Then, too, the Calden verdict was upheld under appeal. Pam was invited to keynote the American Bar Association's annual conference. She chose not to discuss the cross. Instead, she spoke about silence. Silence, she said, is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of fear. And sometimes, to break it, all you need is the courage to wear your truth. That night, 1,000 lawyers gave her a standing ovation. She wore the cross. This time, no one said a word. The story continued to ripple. In small courthouses across the country, young female attorneys wore small crosses, or stars of David, or crescent pendants, some for faith, some for family, some for defiance. In Charleston, a judge reversed a decade-old court dress code that banned all religious symbols. In Oregon, a Muslim law student cited Bondi versus Calden in a motion to wear her hijab in moot court competitions. And in Tallahassee, Pam Bondi kept doing the same thing she always did, showing up, speaking truth, and walking into every courtroom with a cross around her neck and fire in her soul. They called her the crossfire attorney, but she never fought for symbols. She fought for people. And people remembered, even when history tried to forget.